Since we all inhabit the earth, all of us are considered earthlings. There is no sexism, no racism, or speciesism in the term earthling. It encompasses each and every one of us, warm or cold-blooded, mammal, vertebrate or invertebrate, bird, reptile, amphibian, fish, and human alike. Humans, therefore, being not the only species on the planet, share this world with millions of other living creatures as we all evolve here together. However, it is the human earthling who tends to dominate the earth, oftentimes treating other fellow earthlings and living beings as mere objects. This is what is meant by speciesism. By analogy with racism and sexism, the term speciesism is a prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. If a being suffers, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. No matter what the nature of the being, the principle of equality requires that one's suffering can be counted equally with the like suffering of any other being. Racists violate the principle of equality by giving greater weight to the interests of members of their own race when there's a clash between their interests and the interests of those of another race. Sexists violate the principle of equality by favoring the interests of their own sex. Similarly, speciesists allow the interests of their own species to override the greater interests of members of other species. In each case, the pattern is identical. Though among the members of the human family we recognize the moral imperative of respect, every human is a somebody, not a something. Morally disrespectful treatment occurs when those who stand at the power end of a power relationship treat the less powerful as if they were mere objects. The rapist does this to the victim of rape, the child molester to the child molested, the master to the slave. In each and all such cases, humans who have power exploit those who lack it. Might the same be true of how humans treat other animals or other earthlings? Undoubtedly, there are differences, since humans and animals are not the same in all respects. But the question of sameness wears another face. Granted, these animals do not have all the desires we humans have. Granted, they do not comprehend everything we humans comprehend. Nevertheless, we and they do have some of the same desires and do comprehend some of the same things. The desires for food and water, shelter and companionship, freedom of movement and avoidance of pain. These desires are shared by non-human animals and human beings. As for comprehension, like humans, many non-human animals understand the world in which they live and move. Otherwise, they could not survive. So beneath the many differences, there is sameness. Like us, these animals embody the mystery and wonder of consciousness. Like us, they are not only in the world, they are aware of it. Like us, they are the psychological centers of a life that is uniquely their own. In these fundamental respects, humans stand on all fours, so to speak, with hogs and cows, chickens and turkeys. What these animals are due from us, how we morally ought to treat them, are questions whose answer begins with the recognition of our psychological kinship with them. So the following film demonstrates in 5 ways just how animals have come to serve mankind, lest we forget. Nobel Prize winner Isaac Bashevis Singer wrote in his best-selling novel, Enemies, a Love Story, the following. As often as Herman had witnessed the slaughter of animals and fish, he always had the same thought. In their behavior toward creatures, all men were Nazis. The smugness with which man could do with other species as he pleased exemplified the most extreme racist theories. The principle that might is right. The comparison here to the Holocaust is both intentional and obvious. One group of living beings anguishes beneath the hands of another. Though some will argue the suffering of animals cannot possibly compare with that of former Jews or slaves, there is in fact a parallel. And for the prisoners and victims of this mass murder, their Holocaust is far from over. In his book, The Outermost House, author Henry Beston wrote, "We need another and a wiser and perhaps a more mystical concept of animals. Remote from universal nature and living by complicated artifice, man in civilization surveys the creatures through the glass of his knowledge and sees thereby a feather magnified and the whole image in distortion. We patronize them for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate of having taken form so far below ourselves. And therein we err, and greatly err. For the animal shall not be measured by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move finished and complete, gifted with extensions of the senses we have lost or never attained. Living by voices we shall never hear. They are not brethren. They are not underlings. They are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of the earth." For most of us, our relationship with animals involves the owning of a pet or two. So where do our pets come from? Of course, one of the most obvious ways animals serve man is as companions. For these pets, it starts with a breeder. Though not all breeders are considered professional. In fact, in this profession, just about anyone and everyone can be a breeder. For pet stores, most of their animals are acquired from puppy mills, even if they may not know it. Puppy mills are low-budget commercial enterprises that breed dogs for sale to pet shops and other buyers. They are often backyard operations that expose animals to filthy, overcrowded conditions with no veterinary care or socialization. Dogs from puppy mills often exhibit physical and psychological problems as they grow up. Strays, if they are lucky, will be picked up and taken to a shelter or pound where they can only hope to find a new home again. An estimated 25 million animals become homeless every year. And as many as 27% of purebred dogs are among the homeless. Of these 25 million homeless animals, an average of 9 million die on the streets from disease, starvation, exposure, injury, or some other hazard of street life. Many others are strays, some of whom were presumably dumped in the streets by their caretakers. The remaining 16 million die in pounds or shelters that have no room for them and are forced to kill them. Sadly, on top of all this, almost 50% of the animals brought to shelters are turned in by their caretakers. Many people claim they don't visit shelters because it's depressing for them. But the reason animals are crowded into such dreary places as these is because of people's refusal to spay or neuter their pets. Several pet owners feel, particularly men for some reason, that neutering a pet emasculates the owner somehow. Or they may just want their children to someday experience the miracle of life, so to speak. In either case, pet owners like these unknowingly take part in the euthanasia of over 60,000 animals per day. Euthanasia, generally defined as the act of killing painlessly for reasons of mercy, is usually administered by an injection in the leg for dogs and sometimes in the stomach for cats. It is a quick and painless procedure for the animals and by far the most humane, but not always the most affordable. Due to the increase of euthanasia in shelters and the growing, constant demand for drugs like Euthasol, some shelters with budget constraints are forced to use gas chambers instead. In a gas chamber, animals are packed very tightly and can take as long as 20 minutes to die. It is by far less merciful, more traumatic and painful, but the procedure is less expensive. Perhaps some of the tough questions we should ask ourselves about animals that we keep as companions are: can we keep animals as companions and still address their needs? Is our keeping companion animals in their best interest, or are we exploiting them? The answers to these questions may lie in the attitudes of the human caretakers and their abilities to provide suitable environments for companion animals. Most human beings are speciesists. This film shows that ordinary human beings Not a few exceptionally cruel or heartless humans, but the overwhelming majority of people take an active part, acquiesce in, and allow their taxes to pay for practices that require the sacrifice of the most important interests of members of other species, in order to promote the most trivial interests of our own species. The hope for the animals of tomorrow is to be found in a human culture which learns to feel beyond itself. We must learn empathy. We must learn to see into the eyes of an animal and feel that their life has value because they are alive. What happens in slaughterhouses is a variation on the theme of the exploitation of the weak by the strong. More than 10,000 times a minute, in excess of 6 billion times a year, just in the United States, life is literally drained from so-called food animals. Having the greater power, humans decide when these animals will die, where they will die, and how they will die. The interests of these animals themselves play no role whatsoever in the determination of their fate. Killing an animal is in itself a troubling act. It has been said that if we had to kill our own meat, we would all be vegetarians. Certainly very few people ever visit a slaughterhouse, and films of slaughterhouse operations are not popular on television. People might hope that the meat that they buy came from an animal who died without pain, but they don't really want to know about it. Yet those who, by their purchases, require animals to be killed do not deserve to be shielded from this or any other aspect of the production of the meat they buy. So where does our food come from? For those of us living on a meat diet, the process these animals undergo is as follows. For beef, the animals are all branded. In this instance, on the face. Dehorning usually follows, never with anesthetic, but rather a large pair of pliers. In transportation, animals are packed so tightly into trucks they are practically on top of one another. Heat, freezing temperatures, fatigue, trauma, and health conditions will kill some of these animals en route to the slaughterhouses. Milking cows are kept chained to their stalls all day long, receiving no exercise. Pesticides and antibiotics are also used to increase their milk productivity. Eventually, milking cows, like this one, collapse from exhaustion. Normally, cows can live as long as 20 years, but milking cows generally die within 4, at which point their meat is used for fast food restaurants. At this slaughterhouse, the branded and dehorned cattle are brought into a stall. The captive bolt gun, which was designed to reduce animals unconscious without causing pain, fires a steel bolt that is powered by compressed air or a blank cartridge right into the animal's brain. Though various methods of slaughter are used, in this Massachusetts facility, the cattle is hoisted up and his or her throat is slit. Along with the meat, their blood will be used as well. Though the animal has received a captive bolt to the head, which is supposed to have rendered him or her senseless, as you can see, the animal is still conscious. This is not uncommon. Sometimes they are still alive even after they have been bled and are well on their way down the assembly line to be butchered. This is the largest glatt kosher meat plant in the United States. Glatt, the Yiddish word for smooth, means the highest standard of cleanliness. And rules for kosher butchering require minimal suffering. The use of electric prods on immobilized animals is a violation. Inverting frightened animals for the slaughterer's convenience is also a violation. The inversion process causes cattle to aspirate blood or breathe it in after incision. Ripping the trachea and esophagus from their throats is another egregious violation, since kosher animals are not to be touched until bleeding stops. And by dumping struggling and dying steers through metal chutes onto blood-soaked floors, with their breathing tubes and gullets dangling out. This sacred task is neither clean or compassionate. Shackling and hoisting is ruled yet another violation, nor does it correspond to the kosher way of treating animals. If this was kosher, death was neither quick nor merciful. Veal, taken from their mothers within 2 days of birth, are tied at the neck and kept restricted to keep muscles from developing. Fed an iron-deficient liquid diet, denied bedding, water, and light. After 4 months of this miserable existence, they are slaughtered. Sows in factory farms are breeding machines, kept continually pregnant by means of artificial insemination. Large pig market factories will manufacture, as they like to call it, between 50,000 and 600,000 pigs a year, each. Tail docking is a practice derived from the lack of space and stressful living conditions, so as to keep pigs from biting each other's tails off. This is done without anesthetic. Ear clipping is a similar procedure, also administered without anesthetic. As well as teeth cutting. Castration is also done without painkillers or anesthetic, and will supposedly produce a more fatty grade of meat. The electric prods are used for obvious reasons. Handling. Electrocution is another method of slaughter, as seen here. Throat slitting, however, is still the least expensive way to kill an animal. After knife sticking, pigs are shackled, suspended on a bleed rail, and immersed in scalding tanks to remove their bristle. Many are still struggling as they are dunked upside down in tanks of steaming water, where they are submerged and drowned. In regard to poultry, Americans currently consume as much chicken in a single day as they did in an entire year in 1930. The largest broiler companies in the world now slaughter more than 8.5 million birds in a single week. Debeaking prevents feather pecking and cannibalism in frustrated chickens, caused by overcrowding in single areas where they are unable to establish a social order. Today, done with infant chicks, the procedure is carried out very quickly, about 15 birds a minute. Such haste means the temperature and sharpness of the blade varies, resulting in sloppy cutting and serious injury to the bird. As for their living conditions, anywhere from 60 to 90,000 birds can be crowded together in a single building. The suffering for these animals is unrelenting. It is a way of life. Although their beaks are severed, they attempt to peck each other. For hens, they live in a laying warehouse, crammed inside so-called battery cages. Many lose their feathers and develop sores from rubbing against the wire cage. Crowding prevents them from spreading their wings, and the hens cannot even fulfill minimal natural instincts. During transportation, all animals suffer and many die. And they suffocate when other animals pile on top of them in overcrowded, poorly loaded cages. Chickens are slaughtered in numerous ways. Some may be clubbed to death or have their heads cut off. But most are brought through the assembly lines of factory farms. Dangled upside down on a conveyor belt, their throats are slit, and they are left to bleed to death. Others may be placed headfirst in tubes to restrict their movement while they slowly bleed to death. Surely, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, would not all of us be vegetarians? But slaughterhouses do not have glass walls. The architecture of slaughter is opaque, designed in the interest of denial, to ensure that we will not see even if we wanted to look. And who wants to look?
Go, motherfucker! Better fucking stop! Let's go! Let's go!
was Emerson who observed more than 100 years ago, "You have dined, and however scrupulously the slaughterhouse is concealed in the graceful distance of miles, there is complicity."
Fuck on, bitch! Fuck on, bitch! Fucking enemy! You sure about that?
And for those who think eating seafood is healthier than land animals, just remember how much irretrievable waste and contaminated sediments are dumped into our oceans. In the past, oil, nuclear, and chemical industries have done little for the protection of marine environments. And dumping on or under the seabed has always proved a convenient place to dispose of inconvenient wastes. Today's commercial fishers intensify this situation on massive scales. They use vast factory trawlers the size of football fields and advanced electronic equipment to track and catch fish. Huge nets stretch across the ocean, swallowing up everything in their path. These factory trawlers, coupled with our increased appetites for seafood, are emptying the oceans of sea life at an alarming pace. Already 13 of the 17 major global fisheries are depleted or in serious decline. The other 4 are overexploited or fully exploited. The recent outbreak of Pfiesteria, a microorganism 1,000 times more potent than cyanide, spawned from millions of gallons of raw hog feces and urine, poured into rivers, lakes, and oceans, turning their ecosystems into unflushed toilets, is proving the most alarming. Threatening sea life and humans alike, Pfiesteria has killed over 1 billion fish, the Southeast's largest fish kill on record. And it's spreading. Traces of Pfiesteria have already been found from Long Island to the Florida Gulf at distances of up to 1,000 miles. In fact, this water-based Pfiesteria invasion stands as one of the worst outbreaks of a virulent microorganism in U.S. history. It is a level 3 biohazard. Ebola is a 4. AIDS is a 2. And this bug mutated as a direct result of our mass consumption of animals, particularly pork. With hog farms fattening millions of pigs for slaughter, grain goes in and waste comes out. This waste finds its way into our oceans and water supply systems, contaminating the animals that live in it, as well as those who eat from it. Finally, whaling. Though the International Whaling Commission prohibited commercial whaling in 1985, many countries continue to kill whales for their so-called exotic meat. They use harpoons, firearms, blunt hooks, even explosives, or drive them into authorized whaling bays where they are made to beach and can be killed with knives in the shallows. But as though cruelty toward animals raised for food wasn't enough, we've also found ways of making use of them for all our clothes.